I'm about to start working on a project that would look a lot better if it had finger joints in the corners, and so I need to get good at cutting finger joints. It's something I've done in the past plenty of times, and I've got it to turn out okay, but there's way too much variation. I just never know how it's going to turn out until I see the finished product. I've cut them by hand, hand saw and chiseled out the waste. I've used the router table, I've used a handheld router and a guide, and I've cut them on the table saw, both with and without a jig. And the last time I did it, I used a jig for the table saw, and I used my Freud Dado stack to make the cut. And it turned out okay, but the scoring cutters on the outer blades of the Dado set, which are designed to prevent a lot of tear out in cross grain cuts, also leave little tiny cat ears on the top of the finger joints. It just doesn't really look all that good if it's going to be something that's intended to be really stared at a lot, like the outside of a box. Now, if it's for a drawer box and it's just going to slide in and not really be seen, then it's okay. But for something that's going to get a lot more scrutiny, I think that it's better to not have any machine marks showing if you can avoid it. You don't want to see the arcs from the table saw blade. You don't want to see the little grit spirals from your random orbit sander, and you don't want to see the cat ears from the dado blade. So the other alternative to that is to use what's called a number one grind or just a flat top grind, and that's going to cut a flat bottom groove or a flat bottom finger joint without the scoring cutters. It's not going to work so well if you're cutting across the grain, and that's really where a dado set excels, but if you're cutting with the grain or if you're cutting through the end grain, it's going to work out a lot better. I have a number one grind blade, but it's a thin kerf blade that I use for ripping once in a while and for cutting splines for picture frames. I could use it for finger joints, but with the jig that I'm making, I'm just going to have to make too many cuts for each joint to get through. It's only about a 1/16 of an inch wide. It's just going to take me forever to cut each one. So I decided to pick up a thicker blade, and I was originally looking at just a regular 1/8 inch kerf. And then I stumbled across on the Forrest website this finger joint set. This is the FJ08242 finger joint set. Haven't even taken the plastic off yet. This is brand new, and we will take a much closer look at this in a moment. And this is pretty cool, I thought, because right now, the way it's set up, it will cut a 1/4 of an inch wide kerf. And if I flip the blades around the other way, it's going to cut a 3/8 of an inch wide kerf because the teeth are a little bit offset from the body. So this is an 8-inch blade, as you may have noticed, smaller than the 10-inch blade that's in here now, and that's fine. The Dado set is a 6-inch blade because you really don't need to go that high with a Dado stack, and this is an 8-inch. Now, with the 10-inch blade right now, I can get about a 1 3/4 of an inch 2 3/4 of an inch depth of cut. So subtract 2 inches from that on the diameter, that's 1 inch off the radius, and I'm going to be able to get about a 1 3/4 inch depth of cut with this blade, which is plenty. I mean, I can do finger joints in 2x4s, and that's very unlikely to happen, but this thing could do it. The advantage of having a smaller blade is that it's going to be a little cheaper to sharpen, and it's a little bit less materials in the beginning, so it cuts down on the cost just a little bit, which is good because Forrest blades do not come cheap. Anyway, let's crack this thing open, and we will do some test cuts with both this blade and the Forrest and the Freud Dado head, just for a comparison. And we will do these cuts on the variety of wood that I have here, which includes Purple Heart, some Tiger Stripe maple, some soft ambrosia maple, red oak, pear, box elder, cherry, and some Baltic birch plywood. That is a nice looking blade. One thing I like about the Forrest blades in particular is that it feels like it's sharpened steel. Sometimes carbide feels a little bit duller, but the Forrest blades always have a really nice sharp edge on them. Now, we are almost ready to start cutting, but first I wanted to go over some of the differences between these two blades, because the way that they're both designed is going to help us anticipate their performance to some degree. Now, first of all, you'll notice obviously they are different sizes. This is a 6-inch blade and this is an 8-inch blade, which means that even though the arbors are going to be rotating at the same speed, the teeth of the cutters on this blade are going to have to move faster to make one full rotation to keep up with that arbor. So this is going to be cutting a little bit faster than that one. I don't think it's going to be really that big of a difference. You can just adjust your feed rate based on the size of the blade and how it feels. But what is going to be more noticeable is the anti-kickback design on the Freud blade. That refers to these little nubs on the back of the teeth and in front of the cutters on the chippers. And that prevents the next tooth from taking too deep of a cut, because that nub will encounter or engage the wood and prevent the tooth from grabbing. So that's going to avoid kickback, and if you're using a radial arm saw, it's going to prevent that blade from riding up on the wood and punching you in the chest and throwing you across the room. Now, this is very important if you're using a radial arm saw. It's a little less important on a table saw, but it's always good to have some safety features. The other part of that is that you'll notice that if you draw a straight line from the arbor up to the tooth, it's got a little bit of a negative grind there, about -5 degrees, I would guess. And that is also going to prevent the tooth from grabbing onto the wood and hooking into it. It's actually going to push the wood away a little bit. And I definitely noticed that when I was cutting some finger joints on some harder woods like beech and birch. It kind of felt like it was pushing the wood up on the fence a little bit. So I had to work a little bit more to hold the wood down and also to push the fence forward. Moving over to the Forrest blade, there are no safety features here. This is just a plain old dangerous blade. And you see that there is a positive, probably 5-degree hook on those teeth. Now that's not a lot. Sometimes you can see up to 10 or 20 degrees, but this blade right here is going to grab on a little bit, and I'm guessing that's going to help not only pull the blade down against the base of the sled, or pull the wood down against the base of the sled, but it's also going to help make the feed a little bit easier. So I am expecting to have to put more effort into pushing this through the finger joint cuts, and this is going to go through a lot easier. One more thing to keep in mind with this blade, with the Forrest blade, is because these teeth are a little bit offset, when I'm doing the 3/8 of an inch setting, which is the wider part of the tooth sticking out on both sides, it gets a little close to the side of my insert. So I'm going to have to either make a new insert or just run this without the insert in there. And it's also, I had to cut a little bit more on the inside of my sled. So now when I go back to a regular blade, I'm not going to have that 0 clearance edge on this side. It's going to cut it a little bit wider. So just something to keep in mind, that you may have to make a few adjustments in your jigs and inserts. Now let's just go down the line and take a look at each one of these in greater detail, and then you can draw your own conclusions. There are pros and cons to both of these, but some of the results were a little bit surprising for me. Now, the first cut on each of these is going to be from the Forrest finger joint set, also right there. And the second cut is going to be from the Freud Dado head, also right there. And if you get confused or forget while we're going through these, you can just look for the little cat ears right there. That's going to be from the Dado. And also right there, that's from the Dado. That's not going to show up in the box joint cuts because it's a #1 flat grind on there. The first piece was Purple Heart, and I can just sum up the results for both of these saying these are two high-performing blades. The edges of the fingers are very clean, and one thing that caught me by surprise is that when I was doing the cross grain cuts, I was actually just doing this to demonstrate how the Forrest finger joint set was not going to do as well because of the flat grind. It was going to cause more chip out, more tear out in the cross grain cuts. Uh, I cut this 1/4 of an inch deep, and these are both 3/4 of an inch deep. And in a single pass, 1/4 of an inch deep, there was very little tear out from the finger joint set, which really caught me by surprise. I was expecting there was going to be a lot more chipping here. And some of the pieces you'll see a little bit of fuzzies on there, but we'll get to that in a minute. But both of them did very well on the cross grain cuts. So that was the main unexpected result for me. And if you're looking at the walls up here or the sides of the fingers for both blades, the sides were very clean. And mostly what I'm concerned about for finger joints is going to be the back. How much tear out was there? And they both had an equal shot at 0 clearance because I flattened out the fuzzies using the side of my table saw before I ran the second cut and after running the second cut. I haven't done any additional sanding, so whatever is on there is from the cut as it was. And also a little bit to some degree, I'm interested in how the bottom looks as far as how flat and clean it is, because that can also affect how your joint fits. And you can see they both did very well on Purple Heart. There is a little bit of roughness in the middle. Let's see if I can get that at the right angle. It's a little bit rougher in the middle from the finger joint set, and that is because of that chipping blade. It's for removing the chips after the scoring cutters clean up the sides, and there are only 4 cutters on that chipping blade, so it's going to be a little rougher. You can expect that, but that shouldn't affect the joint too much because this area is covered. And on the Forrest blade, on a couple of these, I got a little bit of burning on one of the blades. There are 2 blades, and one was giving me a little bit of burning on a couple of these cuts. And I'm not sure if it is the cause, but this is really sad. But after I did my first set of cuts, I noticed that I had a chipped tooth. And I'm not sure how or when this happened. I cleaned the blades when I first got them. Both sets of blades were cleaned and waxed to make sure there was no debris on there that would interfere. And I didn't see it then. I ran my first set of cuts, took this out, and I noticed the chipped tooth. So I'm not sure if that was a bad carbide or if I just didn't notice that I bumped it on something, but that is just heartbreaking. But that could have been the source of some of the burning because this is on the side that showed up on in a few of the cuts. Otherwise, all the other teeth are fine. So sad day for me, but that's what happens, I guess. So moving on to the Tiger Stripe Maple. This can be a little complicated to cut sometimes because of the changes in grain direction. And we did pretty well with both of these here. And that's the entry side, and then this is the exit side. And you can see there's a little bit of fuzzies from each one, but I would say in this one it looks like the Forrest head did a little bit better, a little bit more tear out there. I think just because of that. Again, the chip removal cutter in the middle only has 4 teeth on it, so that's going to take a little bit of a rougher cut in the center. Doesn't really matter across this part, but once you get to the end, you can just see why it's really important to have some kind of a backer, so you're doing an actual 0 clearance cut on the back. Otherwise, it's just going to tear out chunks of wood when it exits. But both perform very well. Moving on to the Ambrosia Maple. This is a softer wood. This is some soft maple, and you can really see the difference here. Now, because this wood, even sanding, it tends to burn. And you can see again that one cutter with the chipped tooth did a little bit of burning there, but otherwise it's a pretty smooth cut. And let's flip around to the back side. You can really see the roughness here from the chipper, and really not any tear out in the back. I think that would clear up with a little bit of sanding on the back face of this. But I would say that the bottom of the cut was smoother with the Forrest. And oh, one thing I forgot to point out on the maple. It's the next day, so I forgot how the test went. Exactly what I expected to happen did happen. This is a very hard piece of wood, and on the second cut with the Freud head, because of that negative hook angle, this actually picked up a little bit from the table. It's very smooth, and it was just really easy for it to slide. So that ended up not being a perfect cut because of, you see the walls are a little bit off right there. Because it was, as it was cutting, it picked up and just kind of messed up that second finger. So I didn't have that problem at all with any of the Forrest cuts, because one, it's a square bottom and it's positive hook angle, so it was pulling it down towards the surface of the sled a little bit more. I think that only happened with the maple, but I will go back and review before the end of this and see if there are any others that should be mentioned. And then moving on to the oak. See, this is the back side, and I'd say about a comparable amount of fuzzies in the back. And right here, they're both very smooth. Walls are very clean. I think the oak turned out pretty well. And then on the cross grain cuts, this is one of the few pieces where you can see a little bit more fuzz from the Forrest blade. But this is way less than I expected. I thought it was going to be tearing out chips, but it did surprisingly well. I mean, that's a new, sharp, and freshly waxed blade. They're both pretty new. Neither one has had time to get dull yet. But I'm just surprised again that the quality of the cut was so similar between the two in a cross grain cut. And now we're moving on to some pear. That's just a beautiful piece of wood. Looks pretty good on the back, but then when you look down at the bottom, you got some chipping right there. And that's from the Dado head, and again, that's from that chipper that's in the middle that only has 4 teeth. So that was just enough on the pear to rip out a little spot right there. This is going to be affected by the grain of the wood too, but once again, I'm kind of surprised that, well, I guess not too surprised. I kind of expected with that chipper that it was going to do that, but this is the only one I think that really had a chunk taken out of the bottom that would barely be noticeable on the inside of a joint if you're looking at the inside of a box. But otherwise, they both did very well. Again, a very slight amount of burning from that one from the Forrest set that had a chipped tooth. But otherwise, it looks pretty good. And now on to the box elder. I would say that they both did pretty well here. Again, a little bit more chipping from the Dado head, just in the middle. I mean, the sides are clean, a little bit in the middle, but I don't think that would be enough that would affect a joint at all. There's a little bit of fuzzies there that could be sanded off. That's no big deal, but otherwise they both did pretty good. And for another surprise on the cross grain cut, you can kind of see here that, get this at the right angle, that the Forrest blade left a little bit of a smoother bottom than the Dado did. That really doesn't matter for the joint in most cases, unless you get some tear out on the back side, which none of these really had very much. I mean, I had a 0 clearance backer on there, but other than those than the cat ears from the Dado blade. This could be a very clean joint from either one of those blades. And next for the cherry, a little bit of chipping on that middle piece there, but I'm not sure what the culprit was. It was a very thin piece of wood. I should have moved over a little bit more when I cut the second one, kind of how I did for these, but I did not. So can't say for sure what caused it, but otherwise both very clean. And then on the fingers, again, a little bit of burning from one of the Forrest blades. Focus, there we go. A little bit of burning from one of the Forrest blades. And on the back, a little bit of chipping from the Dado, the chip remover in the middle. Otherwise pretty good. And lastly, we have the Baltic birch plywood, which was a little bit of a reverse because the first cut was going across the grain, and this is, at least on the surface, it's with the grain. Now, my depth was slightly different between the two, so you can't really judge by the appearance of that, because this was getting into the glue layer a little bit right there on the Freud blade, and that was still in a cross grain layer. But they both did very well on the Baltic birch plywood. And these both look just about the same. Really not much of a difference there. Two very nice cuts. And there we have it. I'm not going to waste a lot of your time explaining the results for you, because you saw the process and you saw the outcome. And so therefore you can draw your own conclusions based on whatever is the most appropriate for your workshop. Now for me, I am a hobby woodworker, so I don't need to go into full production mode and worry about every minute on the clock. But I also don't want to make 50 passes with a thin kerf blade just to cut some finger joints, because that's going to take some of the fun out of it, and hobbies are about having fun. I also want to buy new tools, because that's fun, and hobbies are about having fun. So I picked up that Forrest finger joint set, and so far I am very happy with my decision. The only thing I might change about that is that instead of getting the 1/4 inch and 3/8 set, I might have gotten the 3/16 and 5/16 set. Just because the jig that I'm making is going to allow me to take multiple passes to adjust the width of each finger joint, instead of dialing in a dado head to cut the exact same width for each one. So by going with the 3/16, the smaller of the two options, I still would have been able to make the dado as wide as I wanted, and I wouldn't have had to make 50 cuts with a thin kerf blade. But I would also have the option of cutting a groove for, let's say, a 1/4 inch drawer bottom, because that's going to be a 1/4 inch, but undersized plywood. So the 1/4 inch blade that I have right now is going to be a little bit too wide for that, but that's okay. I can do it with an undersized router bit or something like that. A lot of different ways to do finger joints, and there are a lot of different ways to make finger joint jigs. This is just the one that I chose. So the jig that I'm building is based on the design by Steve Maskery. Maybe I will talk a little bit more about my version of it later. I would say go to his website or his YouTube channel and check out the one that he designed, because it's a pretty innovative idea. I built mine based on that. I just made mine unnecessarily fancy because I'm a hobby woodworker and I can waste time on stuff like that. So, I hope this was useful to you, and let me know in the comments how you prefer to do finger joints and what you prefer as far as dado head, router table, or finger joint set. Thanks for watching.